Okay.
Well, good afternoon.
Thank
you for coming to our surprise seminar today. We organized last week when we realized that Kristina was going to have the time to come visit us and spend some time. Kristina Gjerde is a senior advisor for the International Union of Conservation of Nature and High Seas policy advisor. She has a law degree from New York University and was out of UCLA eventually. She's a California girl, displaced now living in Poland with her family over there. She's also a Pew Fellow, Marine Conservation, got that award a couple of years ago to further her work with biodiversity and high seas issues. She'll talk a bit about that today. I first met Kristina almost a decade ago now, actually, at the Defying Oceans End meeting in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, where they had brought 60 people from around the world to talk about the future of the oceans. And Kristina and I co-authored the governance section of that, what is now a book called Defying Oceans End, and some other articles from that. I can tell you that besides being a policy analyst and an attorney, she is an absolute advocate for conservation of the oceans, especially the high seas aspect of the oceans. And she's essentially at every UN or internationally related table and conference pressing this idea of better governance of high seas resources. So, Kristina, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I usually start out my talk with saying, how many of you have been to the deep sea? Although I sort of think around here it's a loose question, but how many of you have been to an international meeting at the United Nations? Quite impressive, okay. All right, so you know the sort of complex political ecology of the United Nations and international processes. So what I'm going to try to do is talk about how we're actually trying to use these processes at the United Nations and other international arena to help promote protection for what is really 60% of the planet, or 64% of the ocean. So I'm going to go through sort of a little bit providing my perspective and the legal perspective, the context for the high seas, then look at some of the problems from the governance and conservation perspective, then tell you a good news story about some of the progress that is actually underway, looking at some of the political obstacles that do still hamper our acceleration, and give a little bit of my prognosis for the future. So in terms of perspective, that's looking at where we are. I first started looking at problems of high seas conservation in 1995. They had just finalized the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they were getting the fish stocks agreement up and ready, trying to look, well, where are the gaps in international law? And the Biodiversity Convention is supposed to save the problems, conservation, sustainable use, equitable use of the species and ecosystems that make up our planet. Well, they just simply left out the high seas. They say, well, we're going to attempt to discuss how we're going to cooperate within national waters out to 200 nautical miles, but that rest of the stuff, well, we'll talk about cooperation later. But we do have new technologies that get us out there and under increasing pressures now from climate change, which wasn't even an issue in 1992 or 95, ocean acidification, which is growing in its significance in our awareness. But we're still confronted with a toolbox that is basically founded on 17th century concepts of freedom of the seas, giving primary priorities to commerce and military security. These are still very important issues, but maybe it's time to actually try to rethink the balance. That, just in terms of geophysical context, that when we're thinking about the deep ocean and the open ocean, these are oceanographic terms. They're not political terms. That deep ocean, open ocean, I would generally refer to being as beyond the shelf or off the shelf. I try to convince Daniel Dunn that we're studying areas off the shelf. But in terms of looking at the ocean as a system, it really is connected to what is going on in the rest of the planet. Geochemical cycles that connect us all, and the oceans, we're so often talking about the Arctic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, but if you actually look at it flat out, you realize that it's all interconnected, and we also have to deal with the ocean problems in an interconnected way. But under the Law of the Sea Convention from 1982, we have divided up the oceans into R's, everything out to 200 nautical miles, including the seabed. And then parceled out the seabed, even a little bit, the orange areas that extend beyond 200 nautical miles, but the seabed, the attached living resources as well as the mineral resources have been allocated to the coastal states, and everything beyond that is part of the so-called common heritage of mankind on the deep sea, whereas the high seas is subject to what you get the high seas freedoms. But all of these areas, whether they're within or beyond national jurisdiction, are subject to these increasing cumulative impacts. And if we really want to address the problems of the high seas, as well as the problems of the oceans, we need to start pushing all those buttons and trying to make sure that we can get them all under control. When you talk about high seas governance, people want to know, why is it a problem? Why can't you just go ahead and adopt laws and make sure they're enforced? But we really still have the concept of the high seas as the Wild West frontier. Fishers can still go out and find new fisheries, exploit them, actually down to almost the point of commercial extinction, as they've done with deep sea fisheries, before you actually get a regulatory regime into place. It's sort of high seas, open access, maybe you regulate later if you can actually demonstrate that there's a problem. So there's no one unified international oceans authority, just as there isn't within national jurisdiction in the U.S., but there are a series of sectoral bodies that govern shipping and fishing and even deep seabed mining, but they all look at it from a very narrow perspective of how do I regulate shipping so that it is globally fair, a level playing field, and is most cost effective to our particular industry. But then when you do have these laws adopted, the way they're actually enforced is supposed to go back to the state where the vessel is registered. So you have 20% of the vessels that are out there floating around that are either not registered to any state or are registered to a state that generally lacks the capacity to enforce the few rules that are in place. So you have places like Togo or Mongolia, Bolivia, that are serving as flag states for increasing sized fleets, both in the maritime trading as well as in fishing. And so it puts you in this very complex situation where you have to rely on outside forces, you have to rely on commercial market forces as well as other states. And of course, as I said, the roving bandit syndrome we have very much in exhibit with respect to the deep sea, but also tuna fish resources. It makes people not want to share their information, because if they can be the first to get out there, they can be the first to fish down the stock. But we're not doing this in a total vacuum. We do have fundamental principles and norms of law that have been adopted already starting in 1972, consolidated in the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. But at the same time, what gets the most prominent are, of course, the freedoms: freedom to fish, freedom to ship, freedom to construct artificial installations. But if you actually look at the other side of the equation, we have a good place to start when we're talking about the high seas. We have an obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. We have an obligation to conserve high seas living resources, plus the duty to cooperate with other states if you're actually fishing on a fish stock in the same area or the same species. There is the duty, of course, to control your flagships and your nationals when they're out there, as well as to comply with other international legal obligations. There's the anticipation that new and additional duties will be evolving in order to meet matching circumstances. But what's actually happened is that the political system has frozen up. The countries that manage to make the rules are fairly happy with the status quo. So unless you make a lot of noise, nothing starts to move forward. But we have a different situation. On the high seas, you have sort of the first come, first served. In the deep seabed, the regime that was developed under the Law of the Sea Convention was developed with a view to sort of sharing the economic benefits of the deep seabed mineral resources. There was this big move in 1970, New World Economic Order. They designated the seabed as the common heritage of mankind, and then developed a new institution, the International Seabed Authority, with responsibility to actually make sure that any mining that proceeded was both governed by adequate environmental regulations, and two, the proceeds would be shared on an equitable basis, primarily with the developing countries. But in addition to these, the Law of the Sea Convention has been supplemented, as I said, by instruments for the most part that already existed with respect to shipping. The International Maritime Organization has existed since about the 1960s. They are the ones who are making the rules with respect to shipping activities. as well as waste dumping. It used to be that you could dump as much as you wanted in the open ocean. Now there are actually rules in place that say you have to prove that what you're dumping will not cause significant adverse impacts. That type of rule has not quite permeated into the rules for shipping, however. So we have inconsistent mandates and policies and principles that are applying even within the same institutions. With respect to fishing, you have the U.S. Food and Agriculture Organization, which is sort of mandated to develop resource information as well as to help promote the code of conduct for responsible fisheries activities, but it has no regulatory teeth per se. The regulations for high-seas fisheries are actually made by a series of regional fisheries management organizations that span the globe. Many deal only with tuna or tuna-like species, and others deal with all species within their specific region. So there's still various gaps and overlaps and underlaps. And then as I said, mineral mining is dealt with by the International Seabed Authority. Only recently have we actually started to look at the conservation instruments as a real tool for the high seas. I first got into international conservation by looking at what laws were in place to help protect coral reefs. And you started looking at, well, there's the Ramsar Convention that deals with wetlands of international significance out to 6 meters deep. Well, at least you can argue that coral reefs, tropical coral reefs, are mainly within 6 meters deep. Of course, there are many that are deeper. So we actually got the Ramsar Convention amended so that it could include coral reefs within its remit, and it has sort of helped get aid to developing countries to at least better manage their tropical coral reefs. Conventional biological diversity doesn't, as I said, doesn't apply specifically to the high seas, but it does require states to control their processes and activities in order to prevent significant harm. And then there's a treaty that governs migratory species that has just established a new agreement with respect to sharks. Sharks are commercially fished, but they're trying to encourage sort of global cooperation across the range of many of these species, also for sea turtles. And then on the regional basis, there are 4 parts of the ocean that actually have regional agreements that are mandated to look at conservation and sustainable use. And that's in the Pacific, Northeast Atlantic, Southern Ocean, and Mediterranean. There are regional seas organizations elsewhere, but they're all purely focused within national jurisdiction, mainly coastal areas, and a few are looking out beyond. So what we'll see is very important. If you have a regional institution, you can actually start to make progress on a regional ocean-based perspective. And of course, in addition to the sort of slowly evolving international legal framework, you also have meetings where governments get together and adopt commitments and targets to actually help galvanize action. They're not legally binding, they're sort of more moral commitments, but at the same time, they really do serve to spur action. I can't tell you how many times we've gone into governments and said, you committed to establishing a representative network of marine protected areas by 2012. What are you going to do for the high seas? That they probably weren't even thinking about the high seas when they adopted this, although they were. Many may not have been, but you can continue to galvanize international commitments, and that's why it's important when you have an International Year of Biodiversity, where the Convention on Biological Diversity is developing targets for what we're going to achieve in the next 20 years, that it's really important to get something that's both ambitious as well as pragmatic, that sort of puts 20% of the ocean in marine protected area status or in some sort of marine managed areas may or may not be worth considering. But you need these international gatherings and commitments as a very vital tool in international law. But as we've seen, that we're getting increasing pressures in terms of context of what the problems are. We don't really have any institution that is there out trying to say, how are we going to respond to all this overflow of new information? I mean, this is sort of your job now, is that we're going to be getting changes in species distribution, changes in temperatures, huge number of knock-on effects that fisheries management organizations that meet every 2 years and adopt new regulations every 6 years because there's blockage in obtaining consensus, are they really going to be fit for meeting the challenges of climate change and ocean acidification? It's just something we really need to think about, because even where you do have regional fisheries management organizations, many of them are just simply, as some say, failing to manage our oceans. regional organizations that are failing to manage our oceans. That's what we've seen with the case of bluefin tuna recently, where they've actually adopted total allowable catches, how much can actually be fished in any one year, that are way beyond scientific recommendations. That's twice what the scientists have been recommending. So there's been a consistent pattern of ignoring the scientific advice, and then even when they do adopt something, that there are fishers from, we won't name any names, but they start with an S, that they will go out and then deliberately overfish. They will be catching juvenile tuna, put into pens for harvesting later, so it doesn't quite count against their quotas. I mean, there's sort of like deliberate non-compliance that is undermining any specific rules that are made. And so what we're lacking right now is any sort of accountability for the failure to implement these internationally accepted legal obligations. That's a similar problem with deep sea bottom fishing. That in addition to recognizing that you have a duty to protect and conserve these high sea living resources, you had this bonanza in the 1970s where they started to find these vast resources of deep living fish down to 1,500 meters that would gather together on seamounts to spawn. And as we've learned in tropical waters, when you're fishing on spawning aggregations, they tend to disappear fairly quickly. But these fish, orange ruffy, they didn't know how long they lived. They didn't know what their environment looked like. They did know that they were sometimes catching so many fish in one place that their nets would either break or they would have to throw them away because it was causing the economic price to fall. So they were able to catch so much that they completely undermined their own market structure, but they continued to fish and continued to fish. And it wasn't until Norway actually started to look within its own national jurisdiction and found these sorts of habitats, including through research funded by the oil and gas industry. They really didn't have they weren't telling the fishing industry was not really reporting on the levels of bycatch of corals and sponges that were coming up in the nets. It was only much later that you learned it was 10,000 of tons of corals in the first few swaths through these virgin coral reefs that were generally on the continental slopes, but also on these seamounts that were way beyond national jurisdiction, leaving barren moonscapes like this. And then you also have governance gaps. And when I say governance, I know there's a number of different definitions, but I often mean the way decisions are made, sort of the equitable balance of power. And in the case of the International Maritime Organization, I started following the International Maritime Organization. I left a corporate firm where we were practicing admiralty law. So it was sort of a natural immigration to actually look at the impact of shipping on the environment, even though before I'd been looking at the impact of laws on the shipping industry. But when you go to the International Maritime Organization, the rules are adopted by those with the greatest registered tonnage of vessels. So when you're trying to adopt regulations that the industry will adopt, that's a very smart move. But if you were a coastal state, it was getting huge amounts of shipping going through your straits. As you can see, some of the Caribbean nations, you really have no power within the International Maritime Organization to try to adjust the rules and regulations that are being adopted. And this has been an internal problem with respect to the transport of radioactive waste across the Pacific or across the Caribbean. So it's just the balance of power is strange in many places, but it is possible to make progress. So when we were actually trying to strategize how do you move ahead, people have said, well, pick one priority and go for it. Well, I sort of tend to want to operate on a number of fronts. And these were the ones that sort of came to the fore in terms of actually trying to target the biggest threat right now to high seas biological diversity. Looking at the need ahead, 20 years ahead, how are we actually going to create the institutions and structures that we need in order to manage human activities in the face of increasing threats? Then trying to look at what can we actually do right now in order to galvanize a sense of place about the high seas, that a sense of belonging or shared responsibility that is for the most part lacking. And then of course looking at new threats that keep cropping up. I'm not going to talk about this one anymore, but I'll just say in response to climate change, people were coming up with new technologies to fight climate change through, for example, ocean fertilization. That's where you're taking iron, filings and dumping it into the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton blooms. Well, I got a call from Fred Grassley, who told me with the launch of scientists said it's amazing how much damage they can do to the deep sea for so little money. There were no regulations in place, there was no process, no international organization. So we worked with a number of scientists and international organizations and finally got it a home in the International Maritime Organization, where they regulate waste dumping, and so we're able to classify iron filings as a non-natural product entering the environment. So you just have to be on your toes, know what the international law is doing, but with respect to one aspect of high seas fisheries was this deep sea bottom fishing. There was a number of scientists, again, as well as coalitions of conservation organizations and governments. First, Costa Rica and Palau were willing to speak out about this, but they got the United Nations to say, we're going to regulate high seas bottom fishing in order to prevent significant adverse impacts to these deep sea corals, sponges, xenophyophore beds, and we're also going to pursue sustainable fishing. What was most important in this respect, I sometimes think, was they actually built in a process to review progress by the regional fisheries management organizations, which occurred in the fall of last year. And as a result of this process, they actually brought in scientists, conservation organizations for the first time. These United Nations General Assembly resolutions talking about governance issues are negotiated in the basement of the United Nations. IUCN comes in as an intergovernmental organization like the International Seabed Authority, but only at the mercy of the other governments in the room. If they don't want us there, only one nation needs to object, and then even the intergovernmental organizations are out of the room. The conservation organizations are not allowed in. But at the same time, if you have a hot issue, the governments realize they're not doing the right thing, you can start to move the agenda. As I said, we did get these regulations, and now you're actually supposed to conduct an environmental assessment, and if there's a likelihood or possibility you will cause significant adverse impacts on the deep sea environment, you are supposed to adopt conservation and management measures or not fish, which is a pretty powerful tool, and it's sort of the first time that they're actually putting this type of measure into place. Of course, there's still significant problems in its implementation. It's like, how do you identify what a vulnerable marine ecosystem is? How do you evaluate what a significant adverse impact is? But at least the governments and the FAO and the regional fisheries management organizations are now trying to grapple with these questions. And these are just the criteria that the Food and Agriculture Organization came up with a lot of scientific input and trying to define these. I mean, there's pages and pages behind just these few words, but trying to define it in the context of the deep sea. Also through this action at the UN, we said there's no regional fisheries management organizations in the Southern Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, or in the North Pacific. And so these agreements are now, the South Pacific has actually been signed, should be in course of being ratified by enough countries, so it will come into force fairly soon. So again, it's another example of how you're actually able to create new institutions through going to the United Nations and saying there's this huge hole in international law, we need to do something, you're not living up to your commitments. And as a result, I'd sort of like to say we've got almost 100 million square kilometers of seabed now protected. So most of it is on a provisional basis that they can prove that they're not going to cause significant adverse impacts. They can open it up to bottom fishing in these areas. So again, these scientific definitions of what is a significant adverse impact, what is a vulnerable ecosystem, are absolutely critical to the evolution of international law and regulation. With respect to processes and agreements, at the same time as the UN was grappling with this issue of deep sea bottom fisheries, we were also pushing the broader concerns about high seas biodiversity conservation per se. High seas bottom fishing just sort of personified the fact that there is no institution or even structure that's helping to guide decisions and their impact beyond national jurisdiction. So the United Nations in 2005 actually agreed to set up a special working group to, with a very long title, study issues related to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. We call it PB&J for short sometimes, or PB&J if we're hungry. But it's actually served a very useful, albeit informal purpose, that the governments get together now and talk about and agree upon we have significant problems on implementing our international legal obligations. What are we going to do about it? We have significant problems with lack of regulations in specific areas. One of the things we were able to point out is that the Law of the Sea Convention, as well as the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, have pre-existing obligations to perform environmental impact assessments. I mean, it's a tool that you're probably familiar with here in this country, trying to predetermine what the potential impacts of a project will be. Well, this was not being done in the case of ocean fertilization. Nobody was paying any attention to this. So we're actually able, by using the ocean fertilization example, try to say we need uniform rules with respect to pre-assessing what the potential impact is in activity on deep sea coral reefs or open ocean ecosystems or open ocean hotspots or ecologically significant areas. And then where we're also able to make progress is with respect to area-based management. There's still some declining rapidly number of governments who are still uncomfortable with the term marine protected areas, such as Japan, Korea, or China, but even they are becoming more familiar with the concepts of spatial planning and management, as well as just simply area-based protection. So we've actually gotten to the point now where, again, when I first started on this, the United States was saying, no way, no how. They had a little interagency committee that was investigating every meeting I would go to talk about high-seas marine protected areas, and they'd say, oh, nope. Even if they weren't a party to conventional biological diversity, they still had a full crew there when we were discussing high-seas marine protected areas. But now, of course, with the new administration, they're like, okay, where can we go with this? How fast and not how fast and how furiously, but how can we actually allow this to proceed in a science-based yet precautionary fashion? So it's a very exciting time to be in this, where you're actually seeing this type of progress being made. So we have these new criteria that have been adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity to identify areas of ecological or biological significance. They're very similar to the vulnerable ecosystem criteria. These don't have the same teeth as the vulnerable ecosystem ones. They're simply to help guide governments and regional organizations to identify areas in need of additional layers of protection. So they can be used when you're developing an environmental impact assessment. They can be used when you're trying to design a system or a network of marine protected areas. So they actually try to fit them into the context of, again, this 2012 goal for representative networks of marine protected areas. And of course, the significant areas can form one of the bedrocks for a representative system that then incorporates some of your other common characteristics. And then most recently, meeting Daniel Dunn with that, we were actually talking about next steps with respect to taking the scientific and technical information on areas beyond national jurisdiction. So they've agreed to develop global guidelines on environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment with respect to potential impacts on deep sea and open ocean biodiversity. So they've already had one workshop which is actually trying to compare and analyze what is the difference between what is the difference between deep sea environments and freshwater environments that would require you to have a different set of guidelines. So they're still trying to investigate all the different parameters of deep sea life, from slow growth, that actually mean you have to have a higher level of precaution or a different approach. And also you're dealing in an area environment of much less information. So you have to come up with new tools to actually be able to predict what your impacts will be. That's also urging governments and regional organizations to utilize these EBSA criteria, we'll call them ecologically biologically significant areas, to actually start identifying them and protecting them, including through representative networks of marine protected areas. They're now talking about how do we develop an inventory, it's like a register of these areas of ecological significance, so you can notify everybody across the globe. Because if they're working in the Mediterranean to identify ecologically significant areas and nobody else knows about it, then it's not really doing you much good when you're trying to protect cetaceans in the Mediterranean. Then also trying to recognize that we do need capacity building activities for the developing countries, and in many ways for developed countries, in terms of identifying these ecologically significant areas, developing management measures to protect them, including environmental impact assessments. So in terms of actual pragmatic efforts, what we've already seen is this, I'd say, is the first high seas marine protected area. I mean, it sort of maybe looks like a joke because it's just beyond, it incorporates territorial waters out to 12 miles. And in the Mediterranean, everything beyond 12 miles is still high seas because it's such a small basin that it's been impossible for governments to actually agree on a midpoint line. So right now, the default is just this high seas. But this was designated in 1999 by Monaco, Italy, and France for enhanced protection of the cetaceans in the Ligurian Sea. Now they're on the next step, and they've just conducted a vigorous scientific process to identify these rather large-scale polygons, but they are what they got from experts that were asked what areas would you consider to be of ecological significance and why. And so those are actually going to go to intergovernmental meetings. They're going to be discussed, they'll be chiseled away, they'll be, ideally, at least a large part of them will then become designated as especially protected areas of Mediterranean importance. And then all the governments in the region actually have a duty to cooperate to conserve them. In the Northeast Atlantic, they've gone many steps further. They've committed to establishing a representative network of marine protected areas throughout the Northeast Atlantic by 2010, which of course is this year. And they're just going to sneak in terms of meeting that target by designating this huge area in green, the Charlie Gibbs Fracture Zone, which is an area of intense oceanographic interest from where the Mid-Atlantic Ridge Census of Marine Life project was going. ECOMAR and MARCA. And so they're using the information from the Census of Marine Life to actually document the incredible richness of this area, both in the seabed inhabitants as well as the flow of water currents that create a huge number of cetaceans and seabirds who are coming to this area. But they also have about 6 other areas that they are going to be designating in September of this year that are both within and beyond national jurisdiction, or even one better. The seabed part is within the jurisdiction of Portugal on its extended continental shelf, and then the water column above is actually the high seas. So they're going to give us a wonderful example of how you do sort of transboundary management between national waters or national seabed and the high seas, which sets a wonderful precedent for other areas. And in the Southern Ocean, they just designated 94,000 square kilometer area as a high seas MPA by the Regional Fisheries Management Convention, which just sort of did this for fishing activities. And then they're in cooperation with the relevant regional seas body, they've just agreed to start rolling out a network of marine protected areas throughout 10 other sort of biogeographic regions. So it's really exciting to see, because again, in 2003, they were like, marine protected areas? You're trying to tell us we can't fish in these areas? But this one is adopted by a regional fisheries management organization for a conservation purpose, not for a fisheries management enhancement. That's in the Western and Central Pacific. They've actually started to look at how the high seas and the exclusive economic zones out to 200 miles interact. And so they've already agreed that donut hole and donut hole here, I hope you're not hungry, these are high seas areas surrounded by exclusive economic zone. They've decided to put those off limits to purse seine fishing in order to protect the tuna stock there. And one of the main reasons was not the significance of the area, but simply ease of enforcement. Is that it's much easier to control who's doing what within your own exclusive economic zone. If you want the rights to fish in our EEZ, where most of the tuna are, you have to, the coastal states were able to set rules for access to their local stock by saying no-go in the high seas. So that's just another form that high seas conservation can take and get some very exciting things. And then what Cindy probably knows better is the International Seabed Authority, who is responsible for regulating seabed mining as it develops, has been using funds from the Kaplan grant to actually investigate gene flows in the deep seabed. And they've put together this sort of proposal for a network of protected areas. They're not calling them that, they're areas of environmental interest. They're trying to sort of incorporate the concept that seabed mining, even if it may be incredibly destructive, you still need to put aside very large, significant areas in order to preserve the full range of biodiversity in the adjacent areas. That's good in terms of, so that is an example of linking science to policy. It's an independent project that's actually been looking at the gene flow in this area for years. But we've also got is the 10-year Census of Marine Life that is coming to, I guess, culmination, not an end, in October of this year, that has really shed light on the ocean, giving us a new glimpse into weird and wondrous life forms in the mid-water column, as well as the deep seabed and the surface above. And what I'm really excited about is that we're now able to start utilizing some of this information from the tagging of specific predators, the work that has been done here, looking at the Atlantic tuna population, looking at the work that BirdLife International has been doing in terms of tracking seabirds throughout mainly southern oceans, that's the albatross, petrel, shearwaters, and trying to bring all these organizations that have been gathering this information and processing this information into what we now call the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative. And I'm very happy that Daniel Dunn is here, straight from the plains of California, but we've been working with the Duke Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab for the past year and a half to actually try to compile some of this information to help identify what we're calling ecologically, biologically significant areas. And what we did first was prepare a background document for one of these conventional biological diversity expert meetings that was trying to say, just to even define how you go about applying these EBSA criteria in the context of the deep sea and open ocean. And so, looking in terms of productivity patterns to help identify areas of uniqueness, looking at kernel home ranges for species that have been tagged in the Pacific of elephant seals to try to identify areas where they're spending most of their time and therefore you'd want to try to protect from fishing activities. Looking at some of the work that has been done on sea turtles down in the Pacific, actually trying to identify their high-use areas, even when they're sort of contrary to where you think everybody goes into the more active regions, but these are actually going into the slow-moving gyres. And then actually trying to use some predictive habitat mapping tools, looking at environmental factors that help determine where deep-sea coral reefs may be located. Looking at areas of high natural productivity, as well as using the OBIS records to identify areas of higher biological diversity, which still has problems. And then actually looking at fishing records to help determine areas that the deep-sea bottom fishing fleets have not yet been to, which is also quite some exciting work because we're actually able to get some protective mechanisms into place. You can continue to protect these more areas. So what I have here today is some copies of this brochure, the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, excuse me, which we took the scientific information, tools, analysis, and resources that countries can now use at their fingertips into a more user-friendly brochure that actually we take to international meetings to tell them about the wonders of the deep sea, the high seas, and how it is no longer sort of scientifically impossible to start identifying areas of ecological or biological significance. So that really was a big impediment in the very beginning. Countries like, we can't see it, we don't know it's there, why should we care? So it's exciting to see we've made specific progress. But in terms of actually trying to focus international attention on the problems of high seas biodiversity, we're also taking the second track of looking at applying the scientific information and putting it in a place-based context. So we're now working with the government of Bermuda to actually try to get enhanced protection for the Sargasso Sea. That's working with the government of Bermuda, government representatives from the U.S., from Trinidad and Tobago and South Africa, to actually try to roll out a regional agreement that's going to say we can commit ourselves to protecting, to regulating our own national, but we will also go to international meetings, such as the International Maritime Organization, to try to secure more elevated levels of protection against discharges, against discharges of ballast water, discharges of garbage, or even just simply getting a better grasp on who is going through the area right now, so you can get reporting obligations through on the ship. And in the Ross Sea, which is one of these, what some scientists are calling sort of like the last for being pristine ecosystem on the planet, that, well, it's now subject to increasing fishing pressure for Antarctic toothfish. It's just been opened up for that. But people are hoping that we'll get in soon enough to get it recognized as being one of the areas that is worthwhile putting off limits to future fishing activities. In terms of the political obstacles that still face us, and I think are going to be emerging as even stronger issues in the future, is just simply the equitable aspects of the high seas. We have the developed countries with the capacity to conduct marine scientific research, to apply and obtain patents, and to now consume all the fish that are out there. Developing countries are now saying, wait a minute, we don't have the marine scientific research capacity or the bioprospecting capacity. You will have neatly patented up all the future life forms. I mean, it's just their perception. We would like some piece of the pie. They're already seeing what's happening to fisheries, is that there are, if you want to look at the number of the status of fish stocks, they say, well, there's 50% that are fully exploited. There's 28% that are still able to be expanded. But the fisheries that are able to be expanded are not ones that anybody's really interested in. So when you're coming up, they want access into the regional fisheries management organizations, they want access to the high-seas fisheries. The members are saying, where are your historic rights? Where are your interests in joining us in this fishery? So they're just saying, no, you can't join us in terms of any allocation to the high-seas fish stocks. And what do? If they have the vessels, they'll go out and illegally fish. So we're stuck in this situation where many species are actually declining or depleted, so that in the high seas, it's actually 66% of the discrete high seas fish stocks that are depleted or overexploited. So you only have like 33% of anything that is still fishable. And they're saying, well, no. So you're creating this quandary that new people want in, they want to develop their fisheries, and the developed countries are saying, sorry, no go. So there may need to be some rethinking of how fish rights or fish benefits are allocated in the high seas. So it's an area of growth, I would say. Then looking at security, governments are used to, like the United States, used to thinking of military security as first and foremost concern. So they did not want transponders on the vessels to tell people where they're going. Fishers are the same. They look at sort of their fishing areas as their private property. They don't want to share it. But at the same time, if you're going to have any form of effective enforcement out on the high seas, you need that level of transparency. You need to get transponders, pingers on board every vessel so you know who is doing what where. So we have these conflicting forces, and it's pretty much evenly split between the developed and the developing countries, to the extent that the developing countries are saying, we know conservation is important, but we also think equity is important too. So we don't want to make progress at the global level and the conservation side until you're willing to talk to us about the equitable aspects. And so in a way where those of us with the greatest interest in conservation are being held hostage to the situation of resource scarcity and old rules that give those with historic primacy the first to come and the exclusive right to these fisheries resources. But in terms of prognosis, I was just at a meeting in Doha with the World Economic Forum, where they sort of finally recognized that there is this critical governance failure in the oceans beyond national jurisdiction, akin to what is going on in the climate change world. And they were trying to analyze, they're not just looking at oceans or climate change, they were looking at energy security, they're looking at international politics, they're looking at new ways for interstate relations. But they sort of said, if you want to make progress, you do have to work on the forefront. And what you need are those high-level commitments that actually help to move the political agenda forward, looking 10 to 20 years down the line. You need to be building and strengthening your international institutions and laws so that actually they continue to evolve with the changing needs. And then you also, but at the same time, you need to have these pragmatic steps forward that bring together what they call coalitions of the willing and able. That this can include governments, a few regional governments, as well as industry, non-governmental organizations, scientists, that it's these sort of small steps that you take together in a specific place that can actually help to accelerate progress in these other three areas. And then, of course, you need something that actually helps you measure how your progress is going. So we have the World Economic Forum, who actually wants to convene a review of the Law of the Sea Convention, sort of an expert high-level panel for people to look, is the Law of the Sea Convention fit for purpose, and how can we actually bolster it, recognizing you need to keep this foundation, but actually trying to find new ways to build on it. There's this thing called, organization called Globe International, which is the Global Legislators for a Balanced Environment. It's a group of parliamentarians around the world. And they were just meeting in Ocean State, and they brought 40 parliamentarians from 15 countries, including Indonesia, Brazil, Japan, the United States, the UK, to actually look at some of these critical problems. And they actually agreed to a commitment of 25% of the planet covered by marine protected areas or affected protected areas, and then also suggesting that maybe we do need to look at a treaty to supplement or complement the Law of the Sea Treaty that would be looking at maybe marine spatial planning, given that marine protected areas sometimes would only be dealing with the conservation sector. A way that people are seeing to bring in the other sectors to create a more coherent management regime is by looking more at marine spatial planning. How do you start to prevent the conflicts of use, anything from a hydrothermal vent to shipping activities and cetacean migratory paths, and looking at it from that perspective, and hopefully there'll be more governments that buy in. The European Union, with its 27 governments, has already been past 4 years now pushing for a new implementing agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention. That it hasn't received full traction, but it's gaining support little by little, and this may be, people didn't know what you mean by an implementation agreement. So putting it in the context of marine spatial planning may be something that's easier to digest. And then we have a new opportunity coming up, the Rio from the World UNCED, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, held in Brazil. The government of Brazil has committed to sort of rethinking, relooking at the accomplishments over the past 20 years. And they're going to be convening a high-level panel on sustainability that's to feed into this process. And of course, sustainability of the oceans is absolutely critical to trying to move forward on a global path of food security. So we're able to get support through there, we're hoping. And then in terms of international laws and institutions, governments have started to look at illegal fishing activities, started to tie up the net with respect to what's going on. And to use port state powers, if a vessel is in your port, you can actually say, we're going to inspect it and make sure that there's no illegal fish on board. But what we're actually trying to look at now is actually an ongoing mechanism at the United Nations to review state and regional fisheries management organization performance. Because you have criteria already written into international law, in the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, but the failures to implement these duties, really, nobody's been taken serious in the past. So it's only through a high-level review at the United Nations, where you have countries coming from all over the world, and not just those with a direct economic stake in the fisheries itself, who really need to keep track of what is going on. They say transparency is the best disinfectant. And just in terms of pragmatic approaches, the other thing that's on the horizon is actually trying to look at either small-scale projects, the Sargasso Sea, or looking at new ways to collaborate across the Atlantic Basin or across the Pacific Basin, or even the Arctic. There's a workshop being planned to help identify ecologically significant areas in the Arctic, and then there's the Indian Ocean itself. So just in terms of actually coming to a close here, we do have a lot of work going on in terms of assessing ocean health, new proposals for ocean health index, and these are going to be absolutely critical to enabling us to measure progress and to help communicate the message of the need for sort of global scale conservation. We also need to get into place accountability frameworks. As we're seeing with the oil spill in the Gulf, it is certainly having transboundary impacts, that all the way out to the Atlantic. There is a legal duty that says you're supposed to regulate your national activities so as not to cause harm beyond national jurisdiction. It was basically a problem in part arising from this lack of oversight of what one agency was doing, failure to implement an environmental impact assessment process, so you actually had to incorporate what the potential impacts were. So we need this continuing oversight and more of a balance of power between those who are conducting the activities and those who are regulating the activities, so that it's not just those who have a stake in the economics of the situation, but also all of us who have a stake in the marine environment. So just in closing, I'll just say, obviously there are increasing pressures on the global ocean, and we really do need to scale up, so we're looking at areas both within and beyond national jurisdiction. With the ocean, the high seas, 64% of the ocean, we really can't afford to ignore it. But we do need to get new mechanisms into place that focus and provide a mandate for conservation. We need to get new tools that make sure that sustainable use becomes and remains the dominant paradigm. We need new processes and distribution mechanisms to make sure that all use is equitable. And we need, again, the processes that are going to make sure that governments and the organization and the decision makers are accountable for their performance. And so those of you who are based in the United States, we hope you will use your own training and leadership to try to promote some of these issues. And when you go home to your home countries, to actually do the same there. So that's how I would say thank you. And recognizing the interlinkages of all of this, thank my colleagues, and if you want further information, you can contact me today and tomorrow, and then back in Poland, where I live. So thank you.
Questions for Kristina about that? Hello?
We just briefly mentioned the arch that we have to do with the full or the purview of the high seas umbrella. Secondly, are there any unique conflicts of it in terms of conserving the newly available resources that are now been uncovered with this global classification?
Well, there's one area of the seabed that is beyond areas of national jurisdiction, I think I want to say the Gackle Ridge, the Lomonosov Rib, Gackle Ridge. So there's not a whole lot of seabed area that is considered beyond national jurisdiction. It's all part of the extended continental shelf. But there is a fairly good-sized high seas water column area that does need to be protected. It's the area that contains most of the sea ice. The sea ice is retreating is going to become increasingly important. In terms of governance activities, yes, there are the 7 bordering countries who have a very direct stake in what is going on there, and they are talking with they have the Arctic Council that is on a regular basis trying to look at what they need to do. But I think there are more and more countries that are saying the Arctic is so important in the global climate cycle. It's in part also of the high seas. You have countries like the European Union who would like to get involved, more deeply involved in how it's actually being managed. So if you compare it to the Antarctic, which is the continent and then the high seas around it, they do have a two-tier membership system in the Antarctic. That, of course, the countries with research stations and fishing activities who have sort of a direct stake, the original members, and then they also have cooperating non-members, and you sort of think the rest of the planet could be considered those with a stake in the health of the Arctic.
You've talked a lot of the original slides about the countries have obligations to do this, obligations to do that, but that language is a whole set of kind of vague language about obligation to this, obligation to that. How do those kind of obligations matter in the end? I mean, where would anybody use that sort of vague obligation language to actually get anybody to do something specific?
Well, there is the International Court of Justice, there's the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which are sort of your judicial mechanisms under the Law of the Sea Convention or under international law. So when you go to court, is basically the way you do it. And the way, like this obligation not to harm your neighbors, was a decision from the International Court of Justice back in 1928. I think it's like the first decision we read about, where Canada had a copper smelter close to the border of the United States. And the U.S. sued Canada for polluting its waters. So there's this direct obligation. And so the customary international legal obligations can be crystallized through judicial proceedings. The problem with the law of the sea is that governments have been reluctant to use these sorts of judicial remedies. To take another country to court is not considered proper. But since you do have the international, most of the times you get these obligations crystallized through these international meetings where they're actually trying to define what the obligations are.
Yeah.
Since the U.S. is not yet a signatory to the law of the sea, how does that affect the U.S. involvement in all of this stuff? I mean, my impression is that we're sort of participating fairly fully, but what does that really mean if we go on not being signatory?
Well, it means they can't take anybody to court at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, but they can use the International Court of Justice. To extent we'll find on to that too. What they're missing out on is a place at the table in the International Seabed Authority where they're developing these regulations to govern the exploitation of polymanganese nodules or hydrothermal vents, female. So it would be important to be there.
Are they literally not on the table, or they're sort of there but not officially?
I haven't been to any of those meetings. I do know, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United States is there, and they actually put funding into many of the projects and activities of the Convention on Biological Diversity. They sit, in the room. They do have a voice, along with the rest of us, non-governmental or intergovernmental organizations, to actually contribute, and they probably exert their power just by being there on the sidelines. So you're not totally excluded, but with respect to the seabed, in the Arctic, they have not been able to submit their claim to the International Commission that's reviewing these things, and so their claim is not going to really be eradicated because they haven't joined the convention, but others are establishing their boundaries, establishing activities, and the U.S. doesn't necessarily have the strongest legal foot to object to anybody else's claim.
Obviously, I've been watching this over decades, the interest in seabed life in deep water, and it's clear there, even though we can't see the animals, and people come to me and say, why should I care, because I can't see them, I don't work with them, they can give answers, but so clearly people do care at high levels. I wondered if you had any insight into why that is, or is it, I mean, obviously the Census of Marine Life and all, just this kind of growing knowledge about the seabed, but is there something else that we should be doing? Is there a need to have more, to engage people more with why conservation is important in deep sea, or is it enough to go piecemeal the steps that we're doing? Can you talk about that?
If there were funds available, it would be really critical to actually go out and start educating the public. That's how we've been able to proceed, is by educating the policymakers and the advisors in these international arenas. But and actually, if you want to boost up the level of attention, you do need to create the public upwell of outrage, basically, over what's going on. So, I mean, if there's any chance to express your indignation of what's going on, even in the Gulf, which is affecting the deep sea and the open ocean, now's a good time to do it.
In your response to Mike, you mentioned that it's not considered proper among countries to sue each other. Can you expand on that?
Well, a couple reasons. One, the developing countries, for developing countries, it's a very expensive process. That was, you actually have to develop your case, identify criteria, get a good lawyer, and actually then take it to Congress. That's what, from a sort of political perspective, governments don't like to shame one another. It's only when they're totally outraged that they will actually go to court. So there have been court cases with respect to arrest the vessels and how long you can actually keep an illegal vessel, a vessel that you've caught illegally on high seas or in your exclusive economic zone, how long can you keep them in port and what sort of bail can you impose? Well, that's being brought, the people who are bringing the case are those who are actually being, what they would say, imprisoned unjustly by this country who is upset about illegal fishing activities. So you have to be really outraged, and you have to be able to target it at one specific country. And you have to prove the harm more to your own economic interests than to the environment per se. So that would be another obstacle. It's just simply the recognition of the environment as something that has standing and that gives you a right to sue.
Kristina, isn't it also true that it's not clear what happens if the judgment goes one way or the other? I mean, the court has no power to sanction anyone, actually. They can just say, we find against you. They can't put a country in jail, or they can't even issue a fine that has authority, can they?
Well, the powers of the court is definitely limited, but again, there's a lot of international dancing around the powers of international courts, and they do get recognized, even if somebody may not pay the full level of the fine. But what is interesting is you do have the power to in the international fisheries management organizations, if they wanted to, they could impose sanctions on their members, and ICAT has actually tried to do so. You can suspend a right to fish. You can actually, for a specific period or permanently, you can kick them out of your body. You can impose trade sanctions. The United States has all sorts of nifty tools for actually trying to make sure that illegally caught fish don't come into their ports, and you can actually get a state on the blacklist, not just the ships themselves. So there are a number of nifty ways you can do it that don't involve going to court. But again, there's just sort of this, people haven't considered it important enough. Really, I think that's the biggest thing, unless there's a direct economic interest, like with bluefin tuna.
Kristina, thank you very much.